He informed me about the pad.
Now, the pad, what is a pad? How do you define it?
A pad is a systemized pickup of monies from gamblers in order to give them immunity from arrest.
We must create an atmosphere in which the dishonest officer fears the honest one, and not the other way around. I hope that this investigation and any future ones will deal with corruption at all levels within the department and not limit themselves to cases involving individual patrolmen.
The human soul, the human psyche, needs love in order to survive, just as specifically as the body needs oxygen in order to survive. And for people who haven't been starved for love, that may not be the first thing they would think of. I mean, we kind of take it for granted that we get love from a lot of people. But if you have lived in an environment where you were starved for that, you're talking about a whole different range of experience. Just like with somebody who's starved for oxygen. I mean, most of the time we don't even think about the air we breathe. It's just the air we breathe. But when somebody's oxygen supply is cut off, you realize it's life-threatening in a very short time. Well, the same with the prisoners. They were like people whose oxygen supply had been cut off, but it was their love supply. And I realized that without love, the soul cannot survive. It dies. And that's what these men were telling me. Their souls had died. That's why they were capable of killing other people.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Bretos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The scientific data and empirical evidence concerning violent death and crime is crystal clear and has been documented since 1900, when the United States government first began compiling vital statistics on a yearly basis. As psychiatrist James Gilligan has pointed out, when America's more conservative party, the Republicans, and their generally more punitive approaches to issues of crime and violence have gained the presidency, have skyrocketed. When the more liberal party, the Democrats, regained the White House, the amount of daily and deadly violence diminished because rates of every form of social and economic distress, inequality, unemployment, recessions, poverty, bankruptcy, homelessness, etc., were dramatically reduced. In other words, the amount of deadly violence diminished because the magnitude of economic distress that had been causing it also diminished. The worst form of violence is poverty, as Gandhi put it. Now, in the face of this overwhelming evidence, we have continued to believe, wrongfully, particularly in New York City, that bringing the crime rate down should be centered around an even more expansive New York Police Department organization, practicing many of the notoriously abusive, biased, punitive, and violent policing it has practiced for much of its history. These policies and activities and actions have afflicted and continue to inflict enormous and extensive harm on the city's people, especially on our most vulnerable citizens. That has included the racist victimization of Black and other New Yorkers of color, documented year in and year out by the stark racial disproportionality of NYPD arrests, which of course has led only to more structural violence affecting the city's poor and working poor. We're honored to welcome back to the Radical Imagination Robert Gangi, who was an old friend and comrade in the struggle for a transformative movement in our policing and criminal justice system that would make New York City a safe, just, and inclusive life experience for all its people. Bob has been an activist, community organizer, and public policy advocate in New York City for over 50 years and served as executive director of the Correctional Association for over 29 years. The Correctional Association is the only organization designated by law to provide independent monitoring and oversight of the state's prison system. He's also the founder of the Police Reform Organizing Project, an organization that through research and analysis, public education, monitoring, advocacy, and coalition building attempts to end abusive and discriminatory police tactics and practices of the NYPD. PROP's latest research work has led to a masterfully written and documented the notorious and true history of New York's finest. And here it is, along with the PROP founder and editor, Bob Gangi. Bob, thank you so very, very much for being on the show. It's always a pleasure and honor, and it's just, you clear up so many things so well for so many people. And I know my audience appreciates your coming on and talking about these hot button issues.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just saw a flash on the screen saying my mic was muted, but then you unmuted it. Happy
Yes.
to be here and to delve into these critical subjects that don't get enough attention. So I appreciate the attention that you bring to them.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the attention that you have brought to these issues. Why is it that, I mean, this is a magnificent book, pamphlet here, if you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you put in one pamphlet here an incredible amount of information about material that we all should know about. We don't. Now, why is it that we don't know about the history? This is not anything new. This has been going on for hundreds of years, right? In this city, the sort of abuses and racist, discriminatory policing and so on. So I guess the first question is, why have we taken so long to begin to really become aware of that history? And maybe you could touch on a little bit of what you're referring to, or what we're referring to as that history of
Right. We at PROP, we started, the organization started in 2011.
Right.
And when we started, there had been, and I've lived in New York City all my life, and I'm an old man. I'm 79 years old. And I've worked on criminal justice issues, as you pointed out, Jim, and virtually my entire professional career.
Right.
With almost 30 years at the Correctional Association, where we focused on prison conditions. And then when I left the Correctional Association with a couple of other concerned New Yorkers, kind of people, started PROP. And when we started PROP, although it's not that long ago, just 13 years ago, there had never been an effective, or even an attempt at an effective police reform movement. Whenever there was attention on abusive policing, it was almost always because of particular egregious, brutal incidents, or a lot of bad publicity about corruption. And there would be attention on the issue when the incident that was causing the attention and the headline
Right.
was a brutal incident. The main demand of people who demonstrated was to hold those particular officers, the guilty officers, accountable. There was never a concerted movement for systemic change. And that began to change around the time that PROP was formed, not because of us. I mean, we were part of it. but I think there was the problems around stop and frisk. That was a prominent tactic used when Michael Bloomberg was mayor and Ray Kelly was police commissioner. And people actually began to march and create a political movement to end the use of stop and frisk by the NYPD. Stop and frisk essentially was a tactic, I believe, developed by Ray Kelly when he was commissioner. And it involved the random and stops and very frequent stops of New Yorkers who, for no reason, related to suspicious activity. It was a patently illegal tactic, and eventually litigation was brought that was successful and that required that the city significantly reduce the use of the tactic. But in practice, what it was doing was cops were stopping mainly Black and Latino New Yorkers, mainly Black and Latino men, again, for no good reason, not because they were engaged in suspicious activity. Mm-hmm. In 2011, which was the peak of the use of it, there were over 685,000 stops by the NYPD. That's their own numbers. That's almost 2,000 a day.
Right.
Widely disproportionate, focused on young Black and Latino men. In fact, one of my favorite perverse statistics was in that year, the NYPD actually made more stops of young Black men at the age of 14 to 24 that lived in the city.
Yeah.
So there was a movement to end stop and frisk. And the rationale, I'm sure Ray Kelly's rationale and the police department's rationale was, if we effectively communicate to young Black and Latino men, we're going to stop you for no good reason, they're going to think twice, the young Black and Latino men, about carrying a weapon or drugs when they leave their apartment. Because if we stop you and you don't have contraband on you, we might disrespect you a little bit, rough you up a little bit, but we'll let you go. If you have contraband on you, we're going to arrest you. And that was the message that Kelly and the NYPD was attempting to communicate to particularly young Black and Latino men. The problem with it is that it was patently illegal, unconstitutional, as the courts found, and created more suspicion and distrust and antagonism in the low-income communities of color that you were supposedly trying to protect. And so there was, again, to get back to what I started with, there was a movement to end stop and frisk or to significantly reduce the usage of it. And that was successful.
For a time.
Well, it was successful in regard to stop and frisk.
Right, exactly.
But the challenge is, how to put this? No, the problem with even succeeding with reducing stop and frisk, and the use of stop and frisk was achieved mainly when de Blasio was mayor and Bill Bratton, his first police commissioner, took that job. But the fundamental problem was they didn't change their basic tactic, was to continue to target Black and Latino communities, to continue to target poor people, particularly Black and Latino people, and other marginalized population, like mentally ill people, homeless people, sex workers, street vendors, LGBTQ homeless youth. Those are the main targets and still are the main targets of the NYPD, practicing what Bill Bratton termed broken windows policing, which is when you focus your arrest practices and your ticketing practices on people who are engaged in low-level offenses. Sometimes they don't even amount to crimes. They're called violations. The theory being, if you target those kind of offenses, you will have a positive effect on reducing the commission of serious offenses like manslaughter, like rape, like murder. There's no study that ever proved that that was an effective strategy, but that is essentially remains the fundamental practice of the current NYPD. Eric Adams is voiced his support for broken windows kind of policing. His police commissioner, who recently resigned and is now the acting commissioner, have pledged their support to continue to use broken windows type policing. And so even with the significant reduction in use of stop and frisk, the tactics of the NYPD remain the same, targeting marginalized populations, particularly New Yorkers of color. Your question
Yes.
about, despite all the evidence that this is a blatantly racist practice, and is not an effective crime fighting strategy, in fact, why does it persist? Why is the NYPD as an agency virtually entirely above reproach? That's our conundrum, the conundrum of the police reform movement, because despite all the good work of the movement by PROP and other organizations, the NYPD continues its racist practices every day in terms of who's targeted for arrest. The reason we did the report, and I appreciate the attention that you just gave to it, the notorious and true history of New York City's finest, is because we were looking for a strategy to undermine the sanctified place that the NYPD has in the New York political landscape. Very few mainstream politicians, I mean, there are exceptions like Tiffany Caban and the city council, Ocasio-Cortez. Very few mainstream politicians are willing to do or brave enough to level serious charges of culpability of racist practices at the NYPD. What most politicians, including politicians who identify as liberal, as progressive, they'll call for what we consider tweaks around the edges. They'll call for more training. They'll call for, including implicit bias training. They'll call for more diversity, have more Black and Latino and Asian and women police officers. We know that those so-called reforms are not effective. They do not, studies show and experience shows, they do not change on-the-ground practice of police officers. If the policy is a broken windows policy and you're targeting low-income people of color, it doesn't matter what the training is. It doesn't matter what the personnel is. It's the policy. It's not the personnel. And the policy is every day, the way cops are deployed, the way the quota system operates is they target low-income people of color.
Yeah.
The practices on a daily basis are, repeating words I just used, blatantly racist. And your question really is the fundamental question. How do we change it? How do we create sufficient concern and outrage amongst the broad public, amongst mainstream politicians, that they will do the heavy political lifting of implementing fundamental change? And I hesitate to say this, but we have not, as advocates, figured that out.
Well, let's try to figure that out a little bit here. We've got some time.
All right.
Why not? It's the radical imagination. And listen, I could agree with every word you're saying. As you know, I was involved with one of the very first trials on stop and frisk with Cornell West and others. And there was a week trial. We were very surprised also. I was very surprised to find out about stop and frisk. I only found out about it because the students I was teaching at John Jay began to tell me about it, the Black. Right. And this, so this was something that was so well hidden, but it's also historically so much part of, as you put it, I'm so very glad you put it as, it's not the personnel, it's the policy that we're talking about here. So that's really, really important to understand. The policy goes way back, and I think it rooted in this desire to hold people in their place and to control and dominate and to create fear among those people, and to divide the rest of us into thinking that's the only thing that we can do to keep some sort of order in the society, which we again know it's common sense too. We do know that the opposite is true. It creates more violence. The best place to learn to become a better criminal and a more violent human being is in prison. And what does need to happen is the nurturing, the unemployment opportunities, the education, and so on, the healthcare and the housing, the opportunities that we need. So rather than do that, I think what you're saying is the politicians rely on this policy that they feel they have to promote in order to get elected and reelected. And
right, that's right. And when we embarked on preparing what turned out to be the report again that you refer to and that I'm very proud of, the Notorious and True History of New York City's Finest, we had a very good idea because we had a rough knowledge of that history, that the NYPD was founded, and the research documented this, was founded, formally established in 1845, so a very long time ago. And one of the principal reasons was not to serve and protect, but was to target and restrict and contain two populations that the city's fathers, the powers that be, were concerned about. And that was recent Irish immigrants who began to come over to New York City in large numbers in the 1840s because of the potato famine in Ireland, and freed Black people because New York State had abolished slavery in 1827. So there were freed Black people living in New York City. And over the years, speaking broadly, as a lot of us know, the Irish groups in New York City, whether it was fully intentional or just kind of happened, began to gain a foothold in some of the city's institutions that they could then shape and control, primarily the NYPD. So at the beginning, the NYPD, whoever the leadership was and whoever the cops were, targeted Irish immigrants. At a certain point, the Irish population and Irish individuals, again, overstating this, but not really, kind of took over the management of the NYPD.
That's true.
The other ethnic groups became the main focus and target. And then our history documents this, primarily Black people, to a certain extent Italians, when Italians came over to the United States and New York City in larger numbers. And that targeting of marginalized populations has been the policy and practice of the NYPD since its beginning, and also was the policy and practice of precursor organizations that engaged in law enforcement practices before the NYPD is established, targeting primarily New Yorkers, and in an arrangement that the powers that be in New York City had basically with the slaveholding South, which is to capture Black people, whether they were runaway slaves or not, whether they were actually freed Black people who grew up in New York City, and send them back down South. Again, our history documents that. I should point out that the Notorious and True History NYPD has over 200 footnotes, which is about 200 footnotes in any previous prop report. We knew that what we were going to be finding and stating was controversial, so we documented everything. When I say we, I had very little to do with that aspect of preparing the report. We had a couple of interns and other people who helped us with the research, who did the initial writing of the report. It's all documented. And the reason we were doing it from a political standpoint was to address the question that you raised at the beginning of the show. Given what we know, and given what people who've really looked at how the NYPD operates, how does the NYPD continue to operate in this way targeting certain populations, engage in racist practices without there being any real political consequences to the policy. And the one way to think about it is the historical roots of it have held firm, and so that the practices are longstanding and deeply entrenched. They're not as blatant in the sense of back when the NYPD was founded, the targeting of certain populations was not hidden, not a secret, and was supported publicly by broad swaths of the population. Now, somebody like Bill Bratton, who was the first commissioner under Giuliani and the first commissioner under de Blasio, and who is still the leading proponent of broken windows policing in the law enforcement community in the United States, he'll claim we don't target communities, we target behavior. And that's bullshit. It's clear that they target certain communities. And if you talk to police officers who will speak openly about how the NYPD operates, they confirm that. I mean, there are not a lot of police officers, either current or former, who go public about the practices. They'll talk about the quota system. They'll talk about how, particularly when you work at police precincts that are located in low-income communities of color, you have a higher quota in terms of arrests and summonses you have to make or give out in a given month than you have at a police precinct that serves a prosperous white community. There may be no quota. I live on the west side of Manhattan, it's a fairly mixed community, but it's also a mainly processed community, and it's a large white population. And I'm virtually certain there's no quota here. We never see a police officer. I mean, literally never see a police officer. You go into a low-income community in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, you see many police officers on the street, standing on the corners, and their job is to, and they have to meet the quota, is to make arrests and give out summonses. Sometimes for bogus reasons, sometimes for frivolous reasons. But to get back, you raised the $64,000 question, Jim. Why does this continue? Why does this persist? And in the face of all the evidence and documentation that it's racist.
And so counterproductive, so self-destructive, and so much more expensive. And what also mystifies me, because again, teaching at John Jay, I can validate what you've been saying, because many of the police officers I had in class and would-be police officers said the same thing. They felt it was very unfair, and they knew that. And yet it was so very difficult to go against the sanctity, the sacrosanct role that the police have been put in, that pedestal.
Well, the culture
the police
is
culture.
part of the challenge. I mean, how many television shows that we all watch portray police officers as heroes? And you don't see it's literally true that the kind of thing that you see portrayed in television shows of what cops do in large urban areas, that is maybe 4 to 5% of what the police department actually does. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean pursuing violence-prone individuals who are doing harm to the community. Right. That's a legitimate purpose, a legitimate function. That is a very small percentage of what the NYPD does, and I think you could make a pretty good case that it doesn't do that effectively or efficiently. So we come around back regularly to the fundamental question is, how do we move the political needle? One of the projects that we have at PROP is our court monitoring project, where representatives of PROP, mainly volunteers and interns. Almost everybody who works at PROP is a volunteer or intern. We haven't raised enough money to pay people um, respectable salaries. When I started propping with other people in 2011, figured we could raise money and I could earn a living, earn a salary. We have not paid me once because we just didn't raise enough money. But again, our interns, our volunteers go into the arraignment parts of the 4 major criminal courts in the city: Brooklyn, Manhattan, Bronx, and Queens. We go into the arraignment parts because everyone who gets arrested in New York City has to get arraigned. So the thinking behind our court monitoring project, it's probably a better term would have been called police monitoring project, because we're not going into the arraignment parts primarily to analyze or report on how the courts themselves operate, although we get a pretty good idea how the courts operate. We're primarily doing that, to repeat what I just said, because everybody who gets arrested has to be arraigned. So if you go into the arraignment parts of the 4 major criminal courts, we've only gone to Staten Island occasionally, you see, and we do it on a regular basis, you get a very good idea of what the NYPD arrest practices are, who they're arresting, the race and the ethnicity of the people they're arresting, and what they're charging them with, and how many people get released. Right. So what we have found consistently, and we've been doing this since 2014, de Blasio's first year in office after he appointed de Blasio police commissioner, we see on any given day that we go in, 85 to 100% of the people who the cops have arrested in the past day or two are African-American and Latino, are New Yorkers of color, consistently. We've issued 14 reports. The last one we called Relentlessly Racist. Or no, we called it Racist and Relentless, because that's what the NYPD practices consist of. And we get some media coverage and some attention, but has not contributed in any significant way, and I don't like acknowledging this, to changing practice.
Right.
We're going to release another one this summer that covers the first 6 months of 2023, we haven't analyzed all the numbers yet, but I'm virtually certain it's going to show again about 90% of the people, of the cases we observed, involved New Yorkers of color. When you go into the courtroom, and I'm sure you know this, you go into the courtroom, and everyone you see who's not working there is a Black or Latino person. It's striking, particularly in the Bronx, because the arraignment parts are on the second floor of the Bronx Criminal Court, and you go up the stairs, or the broken escalator, actually, to the second floor, and you walk onto the floor, and you see this large waiting area outside the arraignment parts. And you usually see 40 to 50 people of all ages, men and women, children, young, middle-aged, old. Every one of them is an African-American or Latino person, because that's what the cops. Yeah. And it should be the shame of the city.
Yeah.
And it should be the shame of the politicians and a lot of the media. The mainstream media does not raise holy hell about just how racist the system is.
Right. Bob, let me ask you, look, a couple of things. But also, one of the things that mystifies me too, I mean, the Irish, when they first came over, were beaten up and bullied also. And yet, how can people, it's not just the Irish, of course, but people turn against the very practice that they suffered from? That's one thing that mystifies me. The second, you're raising this right now. Power and money. This is big business. This is big budget. Let's call it what it is. Privatization of prisons. Bratton has made a fortune, many times over a millionaire, with his private security business. The name he has made, that's the goal. That's the goal. The access to power. So again, how many people are involved in the criminal justice system itself around the country? We're talking over 1 million people, a couple million people that are their jobs are dependent on it, their livelihoods.
That is
Go ahead.
very true. And one of the things that is apparent when you go into the arraignment part, for example, and I point this out on a regular basis to the interns and volunteers who go in with us, is how many jobs are dependent on this process. There are the prosecutors, the public defenders, obviously the judge, the stenographer, the translators, the court officers, the cops, the correction officers who help transport people to the courts.
Right.
In New York City, I don't have a number. It'd probably be a good idea to get a number, but it's easily many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are employed by the so-called justice system. So that if the powers that be, or we as a people, made the fundamental changes that are needed, there would be many, many people who would lose their jobs. And you're aware of this, and it's a poorly kept secret, how prisons in New York State became a job development program, especially pursued aggressively under Cuomo and Pataki when they were governors. I was at the Correctional Association that, again, focused on prison issues, and we did some research, and we found this statistic. I still remember this this is decades ago, that from 1817 to 1982, I think that was, 164 years, 165 years, New York opened something like, 30, 32 prisons. From 1982 to 2000, New York opened 38 prisons, more prisons, mostly when Cuomo was governor. Every one of those 38 prisons was located in upstate white community.
Right.
And as you know, 70 to 80% of the people incarcerated in those prisons were African American and Latinos from places like New York City and Albany and other large urban areas in the state. It was a classic example of institutionalized racism, where the one race of people, white people, who working class white people in upstate communities, received the benefits from prisons that primarily incarcerated low-income people of color from urban areas in the city. Actually, mostly in New York City, but the other urban areas in the city too.
Right. And we haven't even touched on, Bob, the probation, parole, all the private organizations that so-called recovery groups and so on that have made this into a huge business, over policing, and it just grows and expands and so on. What to do? Because we are limited in our time. So, let's again say what should be obvious to all the people that are watching this. The police, the cops, the criminal justice system has been, not just in the United States, but has been set up basically to support, perpetuate, and protect ruling economic and political interests, and dividing and conquering the rest of us in the process. So when you're talking about the policies that flow and putting people in their place, particularly Black people in this country, or poor, or right, you're talking about the interests of the ruling elites to maintain a certain order that is best for their business. So that's what we're also talking about in terms of things to do. Now, we're not going to
Jim, it's essentially that's true, and essentially I agree with that analysis.
Yeah.
But and I obviously know much more about New York City and the United States than other countries.
Okay.
But the genius of it in the United States is that the majority of the population is not directly harmed by these policies and practices. and do not perceive that their quality of life is any
Better.
less benign or less satisfactory because of these practices. And I experienced it in a personal way when I talked to a lot of my friends about these issues. It's hard for them to believe what we say about the NYPD, that it is blatantly racist. They don't experience it directly in their personal lives. The picture we present is of a kind of evil beast that is enormously powerful and that inflicts harm on vulnerable people. And so they don't perceive it to be in their interest to make any significant changes. And since, for the most part, they feel they're living comfortable lives, protected lives. I mean, it's true of myself, my wife Barbara, and my family. We lived that life too.
Yep.
But I, based on my life experience, based on what I've seen, based on my politics, I see that the city would be a much more fair, even and safer, and to use the word inclusive city, if we ended these abusive and racist practices. And the quality of life would improve for everybody. And to the extent that there is crime in the city, and obviously there would be less crime. To the extent that there's homelessness, there would be much less homelessness, because we would be taking care of people, and we would have instituted policies and practices that gave people more stake in participating in this society and in entering the mainstream of society. And I think you made the point at the beginning that if we took the proper steps, the progressive agenda, however you want to characterize it, and made fundamental changes, we would greatly reduce the presence of police and prosecutors,
Right.
and the whole punitive criminal justice apparatus. Many few people in jail and prison, many more people getting the help they need in terms of if there are mental health issues, if there are addiction issues, many more people finding decent housing, decent jobs, and even as I'm describing that better way, I could almost hear in my head people saying, that's a liberal pipe dream. We need this punitive apparatus that we see on television, and that protect us.
Because again, they don't see the alternative in action. So let's try and be very concrete. What are some of the policies that you would like to see happen, whatever they may be, that would begin to get us to the sort of transformative world we all would like to see?
Yeah, the very, very specifically, first step would be to reduce the power, the function, and the payroll of the NYPD. So, for example, one clear example is right now, when there's someone who's experienced a psychiatric emergency, the 911 dispatcher sends a police officer or a group of police officers. The NYPD should be totally removed from the emergency response system dealing with people in mental health crisis. We should be sending mental health professionals and peer counselors.
If I can interrupt you just for a minute on that,
Right.
That seems like something the overwhelming majority of people could accept and would appreciate. Not only there's jobs for those professionals, and the police themselves don't necessarily want to have that sort of.
I agree with that, and okay. It's the reform, the change that we and a lot of other people, particularly in the mental health community, are proposing and organizing around, that I think the broad public would accept, because it's on the face of it, it makes sense. Why send a police officer to someone who's in a psychiatric crisis?
Right.
And we also know from experience that sometimes the very appearance of a police officer it frightens the person or causes the person to be antagonistic and aggressive. We don't need cops to do traffic enforcement. Why do you need someone with a badge and a gun and a billy club to pull somebody over because they have a broken taillight or they ran a red light? Cops should not be doing homeless outreach. We should have social workers doing that. Again, mental health people who are familiar with the housing situation in New York City. We should return public safety in the schools to the responsibility of educators, as it was before Giuliani took office, and Giuliani sent the NYPD into the public schools. So
with professionals who would be able to take care of help the troubled kids, right?
So there are very specific proposals that we make at PROP, other people make from time to time, some political people on the mental health issue. Jumaane Williams has demonstrated some leadership. So there are very specific steps that we could take as a government and society that would reduce, I'm repeating what I just said, the presence of police in our lives, in all our lives, and replace that presence with the services and programs that would help people have a better life. One of the things, I ran for mayor, now it's a long time ago, in 2023, and one of the things I did a little research on and talked to experts about the public school system. What's the best way to improve public schools? And what I learned from a number of people, smaller class sizes. And I had that experience when Barbara and I sent our sons, who are now in their 40s. Our oldest son's about to be 50. They started their educational lives at public schools, but the public schools were not doing a good job by them or by the other students in their class. So we pulled our sons from the public schools and sent them to private schools, even though it was enormously expensive. It's even much more expensive now. And one of the things you notice is when I went, when our sons were in the second, third, fourth grade, and I went to, took them to school and I hung out at the classroom, there were 30 other kids in the school. My sons went to Fieldston and Friends in Lower Manhattan. There'd be 12 kids in a class. And you know right off, whatever the quality of a teacher was, that's going to be a better experience for those children. And the research shows that smaller class sizes, across the racial and academic and class lines improves the outcomes for children. And
so channeling some of the funding that we're putting in the military into these sorts of programs that in the long run, listen, I went to New York City public school, so it saved my life. A little older, of course, than your sons, but I had a great education. It was terrific. Why can't we do the same? I'm sure we can. Now, in fact, I'm going to have David Banks on the show, the Department of Commission.
Good luck with Mr. Banks. He's an Adams, functionary.
Well, all right. Well, I'll try to challenge him, but so we absolutely. So these are some very practical. There's as we're running out of time here, but I wanted to call your attention to a couple of recent articles I think were so interesting. One was recently in the Times by Radley Balco.
Yeah, exactly.
After police force quit crime, and then the other one, which I'm sure you saw, I think this was in June. What happened when a Brooklyn neighborhood policed itself for 5 days? So you want to comment on either one of those or both?
What Balco's op-ed about was a community, I think, outside Minnesota. Outside
Minneapolis,
which showed that crime went down. Well, a
very rich community,
a well-to-do community. Whoever was in charge appointed a black individual to head the police department. And a lot of the white officers quit, so there was fewer cops available to patrol the community or do whatever cops do, and crime went down. Another example of that was in 2014, the end of 2014 into 2015, when the NYPD and the Patrolman Benevolence Association, which is the union for the NYPD officers, protested against de Blasio, because de Blasio, when after the killing of Eric Garner by New York police officers, de Blasio expressed some sympathy for the parents of black children and how they have warned their children again, to be very, very careful whenever you're interacting with police officers, because of what police officers might do to you because you're a black person. And so the cops turned on de Blasio. They did a work stoppage. And for 3 weeks, I think it was the end of December into January, and crime went down.
Yeah.
It was the sort of an emperor has no clothes movement. I remember there was an article in some publication where they interviewed some black people, and there was one young black man said, "So this is what it's like to be a white person in New York City," meaning he wasn't harassed by the cops for a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
There is sufficient evidence that we don't need more policing to deal with the crime problem. We need more social and economic development. We need to strengthen families and communities. It's the best way to create stable communities and to reduce the violence in communities and the criminal activity in communities. One of the reasons why there's relatively little crime in the community where I live on the west side of Manhattan is because it's a stable community. Most of the people have decent apartments. Most of the people probably, as far as I can perceive, have jobs. They're able to take care of their children. And they have a stake in the society, and they have, in effect, are being included in the society in the way it operates.
Right.
And that's not true in many low-income communities of color. And having a large police presence there basically is a message that the society sends to them: we're here to control you, contain you, and to punish you.
No.
It's a counterproductive approach, and it's an inhumane approach. And in New York City, since the people being targeted are primarily people of color, it's racist.
Absolutely. Listen, we only have about a minute to go, so I wanted to again put this is an unbelievable text here. How can people get this or look at it or online, or tell us about that and get in touch with you? And then
people can get in touch with me directly. My email is rpagangi, rpagangi, my last at gmail.com, and request a report.
Right.
We're also interested in making presentations at schools, at community organizations, at churches, based on the findings in the report. As a way to educate people about the what we call the notorious history of the NYPD and its racist practices, and how we as a city should take steps to end those practices.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my final question, I don't know exactly, just popped into my head here. It's a little off the wall, but I don't know, talking with you, what do you think, impossible answer, but what do you think if we had John Lindsay as mayor today? How do you think he would be responding to some of this, some of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I don't think, I think Eric Adams is, from the standpoint of, he's a pro-police mayor, unapologetically, really.
Yeah.
So it's just like under Giuliani. I think some cops at least will be more aggressive and feel more less concerned if they act out in violent or abusive ways. But the policy under every mayor that New York City has ever had, including even LaGuardia, who legitimately is thought as a great progressive leader, engage in the same kind of practices. When LaGuardia was, and so I don't think there'd be much difference under John Lindsay. An example I like to point to, in the mid-'30s, there was a riot known as the Harlem Police Riot in Harlem, and LaGuardia appointed a commission to study the causes of it, and the commission issued a scathing report about the inequality in New York City and about the abusive practices of NYPD as a primary cause of the uprising in Harlem. And LaGuardia shelved the report.
Sheldon.
History.
Bob, unfortunately, we could spend days and days on. We'll have you get again on the show. Gotta run. We're over time. Thank you so much for your work. Keep on.
Thank you, Tim, and I'm happy to come back. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you all for being with us this week on The Radical Imagination. Call Bob up, get your copy. It is unbelievably important that you read this. Thank you all for being part of our audience this week, and we'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
Salute.
Salute.
Prisons now are based on, among other things, but this is a major component, they're based on the notion that somehow punishment is a good thing. The assumption here is when somebody's done something bad, the only way we can teach him not to keep doing that bad thing is to punish him, and that will teach him. The fact is, we know that that is exactly the opposite of the truth. We have abundant evidence, many different lines of evidence, showing that punishment does not inhibit or prevent